So if you're unable to stay for the whole thing today, it will be posted at a later date, and so you'll be able to rewatch or watch from the beginning. This is Tracking Blood Flow to the Head and Dysautonomia with Dr. Amanda Miller. I'm Ellie Jackson. I'll be your host tonight. I'm the development director here for Dysautonomia International. We're so happy that you guys could join us. We're going to start off by a little introduction for Dr. Miller. Dr. Amanda Miller earned her PhD from Penn State Hershey. She's a neuroscientist and assistant professor in physical therapy at Lebanon Valley College and a consultant for Lumia Health. Her POTS research has focused primarily on cognitive dysfunction, vascular abnormalities, and the relationship between POTS and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Dr. Miller developed POTS symptoms when she was a teenager, and she was later diagnosed with hypermobile EDS. Shortly after that, she became a founding member of Dysautonomia International Patient Advisory Board, and she started engaging in research with leading POTS experts. We're excited to watch her career evolve and support her along with early career autonomic researchers. The research she's presenting tonight won the Patient's Choice Award at a recent conference in Chicago, and she'll be sharing some new updates this evening. Amanda, Dr. Miller, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellie, for the introduction. I'm really honored to be invited to give this webinar tonight and be able to show some of the data I've been working on lately with Lumia Health. And I was really surprised and excited that this won the Patient Choice and New Investigator Award at the conference. So I'm glad that everyone watching, maybe if you were at the conference, you're already interested in this topic. And if you've never heard of blood flow to the brain or Lumia, we'll catch you up to speed. Are my slides going to change? There we go. Like Ellie said, I am a consultant for Lumia Health, so that is a big conflict. For years, I used to have no disclosures on my slide, and I would joke like, "Someone please pay me." So thank you, Lumia. I wanted to start my story at the beginning. Basically, how did I start researching blood flow to the brain? Because I've kind of been doing it for my whole career, which is only 13 years. But still, I started as a POTS patient, like Ellie mentioned. I have been sick since I was 15. I got diagnosed at 21. And I was actually, I always wanted to go into some type of medical research. And I was a biology major in college. My first research lab, ironically, I got in trouble for sitting during an experiment. And I got diagnosed with POTS a few months after that. And I thought, maybe I should do POTS research because they'll probably be understanding of my disabilities. So I am from the New York City area. I contacted this expert who was local to me to work with him in the summer. And I basically said, like, can I just come for the experience? And he was like, sure. His name was Julian Stewart. He recently retired, but he did a lot of the foundational work on blood flow abnormalities and physiology behind POTS. I didn't really know that at the time when I started working with him. I was more of a behavioral science person. That was my major in college. But he actually thought my greatest attribute was that I was a POTS patient, which I think was great. He really instilled in me the importance of involving patients in research questions. And after working with him for a few weeks, he was really interested in brain blood flow and the topic of brain fog. And he asked me, he's like, do you have brain fog? What is brain fog? And I was like, yeah, of course I have brain fog. And so he's like, okay, what is it? And I was like, I don't know. I feel like I can't think, but I couldn't really explain it. So what I ended up doing was I was like, I'll figure it out. I'll ask some of my friends, which turned into a focus group that we call in research. And then I developed a questionnaire that got sent out to 150 people. Here I am presenting a poster when I was a college student with Dr. Stewart on that data. I'm not going to go through all of it because I've presented it several times, but basically we asked people open-endedly to describe what brain fog is, and these are the answers we got. And what was interesting is these link to different cognitive domains, which I described on the right here. So these relate to complex attention, learning and memory, and language, which are future research after this showed are impaired in POTS. Something interesting that came out of this paper, if you have POTS, you probably know that you can feel brain fog while you lie down, and lying down doesn't always fix it. But this was a surprise to several researchers who think of POTS and orthostatic intolerance as only being orthostatic, and everything is fixed when you lie down. And we got data from patients saying that they can experience brain fog in the lying down in the supine position, lying down, and that doesn't always fix it. So I'd just like to say I started my conversion from a patient to a scientist while I was still pretty sick. I was actually bedridden for part of college, and like I said, I published this paper like shortly after I finished college. So you definitely don't need to be a doctor to get involved in research. Um, and this paper has been cited over 150 times. It's one of the top papers I've published. So this research was really instrumental to my career. So fast forward like 13 years, I just like to tell that story in case there's anyone here who's considering a career in science or medicine or has a child with POTS with possibly um, deciding what career path to go into. I think that the doors are open and there are several people who are following this now, becoming a scientist or clinician with POTS. And I think that's really important. Anyway, I got a PhD in neuroscience after that, and I've been focusing on blood flow regulation and how the autonomic nervous system affects that. I actually first heard of Lumia when they were at the 2023 conference. And at first I was really skeptical about it. And then I realized that what they're doing is really cool and it fit my research interests and my experience really well. And I'm excited to be part of the team now. So something that we know is that POTS is more than tachycardia. And there's this debate that happens in at conferences among autonomic experts. It happens in doctors' offices, and it happens between people with POTS as well. Is heart rate actually required for POTS? So it's the one biomarker that's really easy to measure, and it's something that has defined POTS. But then there's this group of people who have the symptoms of orthostatic intolerance or POTS, but don't meet the blood pressure or heart rate criteria. And then what do we call it? There's this term POTS without the T. Sometimes we just call it OI, dysautonomia. There's actually terms related to like a decrease in cerebral blood flow that not a lot of people use. We have chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, and now functional neurologic disorder is floating around, which is very controversial. Um, if you have POTS, you probably know that the heart rate itself is not, or the tachycardia is not your primary symptom, and POTS is a lot more than that. So I'm going to talk to you today about why brain blood flow is a good biomarker that we should be measuring more in people with POTS, dysautonomia, and related conditions. So I'm going to start off in most basic neuroscience terms of why do we need to get blood flow to the brain? You need blood flow to deliver nutrients to your brain. Large molecules go through the blood flow, so that's oxygen, which is very important, and glucose to fuel your brain. The brain is the most metabolic organ. It uses about 20% of the body's energy. And 80% of the blood flow that gets to the brain is delivered by the carotid arteries, which I'll talk about more and how Lumia is looking at those arteries. We measure cerebral blood flow mainly by looking at the velocity or speed and direction of blood that is flowing through the arteries. You can do this traditionally, it's done by using ultrasound technology. We can do transcranial Doppler that goes by the temple. Extracranial ultrasound, usually at the carotid, where you actually can measure flow of blood because you can visualize the whole artery as well as look at the velocity. And then new methods are using pulse wave analysis, which gets you a velocity waveform similar to ultrasound. And I'll show you how Lumia is working to do that. There's also some measurements where you can look at oxygen consumption of the brain, which is an index for how much flow is getting to the brain because oxygen is delivered by blood flow and the brain doesn't really change its extraction of blood flow from, I mean, it's extraction of oxygen from blood flow because it's operating at optimal standards. In the physiology world, people talk about this a lot, the change in oxygen consumption from blood, which happens in different muscles, but the brain is always extracting maximal oxygen. So flow and oxygen are kind of interchangeable. Um, this is done in research by using near infrared spectroscopy, which some devices are working on making more remote versions of this as well, where you stick a patch on the forehead, and this looks at frontal lobe activation, which is more indicative of cognition. And then a technique that I've actually used in my research is bold fMRI, which a lot of you have probably had a brain MRI, but this isn't as much of a structural scan. This is looking at oxygen uptake and the replacement of deoxygenated hemoglobin after the oxygen is used. It's a research technique. It's not used clinically yet for anything, but there are obviously limitations with MRI, claustrophobia, implanted metal. It's also very expensive. So the gold standard has really become, especially for OI, of measuring blood flow velocity is with transcranial Doppler ultrasound, which looks at the middle cerebral artery in the brain. This is the biggest cerebral artery that feeds most of the central part of the brain, including the autonomic centers. This is done with an ultrasound probe, like I mentioned, that's fitted on the temple. You can see the technician holding that on someone's forehead. The problem is ultrasound doesn't do well against bone. It just reflects the waves, so you have to find this window to get into the skull, which can be too small in some patients. It can be smaller than the probe, so it's not always easy to obtain a good signal. I also wanted to introduce this concept of cerebral autoregulation. So in healthy people, blood flow to the brain is very well preserved despite changes in blood pressure. So you can see this outline, this red square shows the range in mean blood pressures where cerebral blood flow should not change. So this is from 50 millimeters mercury to 150 in most people at rest. This can change with exercise, actually changes during pregnancy, which I think is interesting. But what we have seen is in POTS that mild changes in blood pressure, even within this range, can alter cerebral blood flow to a great extent.
Amanda, someone has a
Mhm.
question asking if this can be the cause of intense pressure feeling in the head.
Um, I don't know if there's good research showing like the cause of a lot of symptoms, but it could be related. I can't like answer that definitively.
Thank you.
Okay. So when people talk about cerebral blood flow, this is not new research. This research on cerebral blood flow impairments in POTS dates back at least 20 years starting. This study was published in 2009 that just did a head-up tilt in and looked at cerebral blood flow with transcranial Doppler. And basically they saw in POTS patients, their blood flow to the head during tilt dropped double what it did in healthy controls. And that was pretty significant. So like I mentioned, blood pressure, despite blood pressure changes in healthy people, cerebral blood flow should stay pretty consistent. However, in POTS, can you see my cursor, Ellie? Or should I bring up a
Yes,
laser?
we can.
Okay, good. Um, despite small fluctuations in blood pressure, cerebral blood flow tends to drop. So you can see this pattern over time, where there's big drop in cerebral blood flow velocity during head-up tilt. So something I like about Dr. Stewart's group is they measure everything simultaneously and integrate the signals, and it's really cool to look at the time course of what happens. If Daniel's watching, he'll probably hate the title of this slide. We're trying to find a good term to describe this phenomenon, but heart rate is actually one of the last responses that happens during head-up tilt. So what actually happens first, time-wise, is that there's this drop in cerebral blood flow velocity. Next, we see this drop in arterial pressure that follows. We see a rise in ventilation, which is really interesting because a lot of POTS patients have this postural hyperventilation where people basically breathe faster when they stand up. There are some doctors out there who think that's anxiety. It's actually a chemoreceptor response, which there's chemical receptors in the brain that sense the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen that are in the blood essentially, and cause you to breathe faster if there's a decrease or an imbalance. Anyway, that's a physiological finding that we see is a response to the decreased blood flow. And then the last thing that happens is heart rate. And I think this is important to demonstrate because heart rate is usually the thing we measure. It's the easiest to measure. It's what you can track on your Fitbit. It's what the doctor can measure in the office. But it's actually a delayed response to the physiology that's happening. There's also this phenomenon we see in POTS where there's greater oscillation in cerebral blood flow velocity. So this is showing what happens supine and during tilt in a control subject and a POTS patient. So you can see in the control, there's a little bit of fluctuation in their blood flow. But in POTS, there's these tremendous fluctuations in their blood velocity that happens during head up tilt with the changes in blood pressure. So there's just more fluctuations and pulsatility to this, which the brain doesn't like to see. They want stability. So even if there's changes in blood pressure, that you have pretty stable flow. But in POTS, the cerebral blood velocity tracks almost identically to the blood pressure signal, which is shows impairment in that cerebral autoregulation mechanism. And this is just compiled data from those examples I showed. So the black line is control subjects and their change in flow velocity, and then the light gray line is the POTS participants. So as you get to greater orthostatic stress, they were doing different angles of head up tilt, so like going from 15 to 30 to 45. There was just more oscillation in the signal, which shows a decreased ability for the brain to get stable flow and for the body to control that. So overall, what is happening to brain blood flow in POTS? So we saw that there's a greater drop in blood flow in POTS compared to healthy people when they get upright. There's minor fluctuations in blood pressure that alter blood flow dramatically in POTS, and that doesn't happen in the healthy controls. And then we also see that decreased blood flow to the brain happens before tachycardia, and that's pretty consistent. So no wonder we don't feel very good because the blood flow signal to the brain is not stable. So most of these studies use transcranial ultrasound. Like I said, that's the gold standard method. However, it's not widely available, mainly due to cost. So a lot of the big autonomic centers, like if you go to Vanderbilt or Dr. Novak, or like doctors who care about measuring cerebral blood flow and have a big academic center that has ultrasound available, you might be able to get this during tilt. It's not standardly done though. It really depends on the lab. It's expensive. It's not as available. There's a wide range in technician skill, so it takes a lot of training to do this technique well. Often when clinicians are in a rush doing autonomic testing, if they can't get a good signal or they lose the signal during the study, the signal quality is not that good. It tends to move, especially during head up tilt. The probe can move and then you lose the signal. There's also this, we call it the y-axis problem. So small movements of the probe cause a big change in signal quality. So if you get a change in data, it's hard to tell whether it's because you moved the probe or if that's actually something that happened and is a physiological finding. And then another big problem with it is it's not portable. So you can do it during a head up tilt, but we all know that head up tilt is not super indicative of what patients experience in their daily life. So someone could be very symptomatic and just not show the symptoms during that tilt table test. Okay. So now I'm going to go into this award-winning poster and the data I showed with it. So basically, using the Lumia device, which is a new in-ear wearable, that the data with the Lumia correlated to dysautonomia symptoms better than heart rate does. Like I said, heart rate, not a great marker, even though that's what defines POTS and what we've used for decades. So this study we actually was completed at the Dysautonomia International Conference in 2023. There were 20 patients with OI, 90% of them had POTS, and then 10 healthy controls that were recruited in the Boston area after the study. People had self-reported diagnosis of POTS or orthostatic intolerance. What's important about this study is people actually remained on any treatments. We didn't tell them to stop medication. We didn't tell them to limit their salt intake or take off their compression garments or what. We wanted people to be optimized in whatever treatments they thought were helpful and were prescribed. Which may not sound important, but most research studies have people with POTS go off medication, sometimes for several weeks or a month before the study. So they want people to be like more symptomatic, but we just wanted to study people as they were. So what they did in the study is lay down for 5 minutes and then stood up for 5 minutes wearing the Lumia device. We had people rank the severity of their symptoms every minute. So we weren't asking about a specific symptom like palpitations or lightheadedness or nausea. It was basically like, did you experience any orthostatic symptoms on a scale of 0, none, to 5, worst possible? And so the patients and the POTS participants and the healthy controls ranked their symptoms every minute. So like I said, most people were taking different treatments. 90% were increasing salt, not surprising, on different hemodynamic medications like midodrine or beta blockers. Some people use IV fluids and may have even gotten an infusion right before the conference if they were trying to optimize how they were feeling to be able to participate in the conference. And then 35.5% were wearing compression of some type during the study. So this is what the Lumia device looks like. We have 2 different devices. The one used in the study was called the over-ear device, which is a larger research grade device that collects data more continuously and stores more data. That's why it's bigger. It kind of looks like a hearing aid. The consumer wearable, which I have one in place, is a lot smaller. It's meant for one user, and it doesn't track data as continuously. So it's a little smaller and more comfortable to wear for continued use. The way this device works is by looking at a branch of the external carotid called the posterior auricular artery, which is a pretty superficial artery. And by shining a light on this artery, we're able to get a blood flow signal that's indicative of the blood flow going to the brain through the left carotid artery. Okay. So what we measure with the Lumia Flow Index is a corrected carotid flow time. This is an index of fluid responsiveness that's actually used in intensive care units to look at fluid volume responsiveness if people will respond to IV fluids. And it's an index of how dehydrated or volume impaired you are. The reason we did this is to account for that y-axis problem that happens when we look at cerebral blood flow velocity with ultrasound. It's hard to compare the two because the signals can be so variable. So by calculating the time it takes for the blood flow to flow during the systolic time frame corrected for heart rate, we're able to get this nice index of flow time. And a decreased flow time is indicative of decreased volume status, reduced cardiac output and stroke volume, and then less blood flow to the head. So you may have heard those terms if you're more of a physiology buff. Anyway, that's just a little bit about what we're measuring with Lumia. So I'll go into some of the results. First, we looked at heart rate and blood pressure, like most studies do. What's interesting here is that, so for these graphs, the healthy controls are in the red lines, or wait, no, that's not right. Healthy controls are in the blue lines and POTS is in the red lines. So you can see heart rate went up a little more in the POTS group, about 15 beats per minute, controls were 11. Now, you might be thinking that's not POTS. POTS is 30 beats a minute or more. But like I said, people were on treatments. Not everyone had POTS in this study. There was some OI, maybe without POTS mixed in. So it's not surprising that we didn't see 30 beats per minute in everyone. Could be, people, some of the participants were on beta blockers or Kolinor, so they would have an impaired heart rate response. We didn't see a change in blood pressure in really either group, the health controls or the orthostatic intolerant. But what was interesting is when we looked at that flow index change over time, when we had people transition to stand in the healthy controls, their flow with the Lumia stayed pretty stable. But in the orthostatic intolerant group, we saw this decrease in flow immediately with standing that got a little worse 1 minute in and then kind of stayed stable throughout the study. When we calculate the percent change, this was about 2.5 times more in the orthostatic intolerant group compared to healthy controls. So we saw a 17% decrease in dysautonomia compared to a 6% decrease in blood flow with the Lumia device in the controls. So that's pretty significant and pretty comparable to what we were seeing with that ultrasound data, looking at cerebral blood flow velocity. So the last thing we looked at was symptom score. Like I said, we asked every minute, how severe are your symptoms? In the orthostatic intolerance, when they stood up, they got symptoms that kind of increased at the 6 to 7 minute mark and then stayed pretty stable. In the healthy controls, most of them weren't symptomatic when they stood up. There were a few that felt some symptoms when they just transitioned to standing. So a lot of healthy people sometimes get this initial, like, I feel dizzy if I stand up too quickly, but then it went back to baseline for them. So we didn't really see a change in the symptoms in the healthy control group. So then we tried to correlate the change in the Lumia flow index with the symptoms, and we saw that there was a correlation. So as people's symptoms got worse, they did have a greater change in their flow index, and this was correlated. The healthy controls, like I said, they didn't really have a change in symptoms on the y-axis, so that didn't correlate really to the blood flow index. In contrast to that, there was no correlation between heart rate or blood pressure with the symptom scores. So heart rate was not a good indicator of how symptomatic people felt when they stood up. So in conclusion for the study, the Lumia flow index discriminated pretty well between dysautonomia and healthy participants, better than changes in heart rate or blood pressure did. Sure. It's over there. Sorry, I have a kid walking in. Okay. And these data promote the usefulness of Lumia as an objective physiological measurement of orthostatic symptoms. Okay. So the next thing we did that we didn't actually present at the Dysautonomia International conference, but have presented this since at the American Autonomic Society conference, is that Lumia flow index compares pretty well to TCD ultrasound. Hold on a second. Sorry, I have a 7-year-old barging into my room here. Okay, so what we showed in this graph was the blue is the TCD flow time, transcranial Doppler, and the red is the Lumia measured flow time. So what you can notice here is that both devices tracked really similarly to each other. So when there was a drop in flow time that was shown by TCD, there was a really similar time course of the drop with the Lumia device. We had people wear these both. You can see our model here is wearing both the TCD headband and the Lumia over-the-ear device simultaneously. And what we saw in these different positions, supine, standing, seated, then standing again, seated, marching in place. And then we did some different breathing maneuvers, the Valsalva maneuver, which you may have done during autonomic testing, deep breathing, and then hyperventilating. So we see changes in flow in these different conditions, and they track really similarly between the transcranial Doppler and the Lumia device. So we took all those data points from the different positions and ran a correlation across 18 subjects and found basically the most beautiful correlation I've ever seen. And people noticed this at the Autonomic Society conference as well. So a perfect correlation would be a value of 1, which means the data points are identical. And what we showed in this was a correlation of 0.9, which a good correlation is usually like 0.4 or higher. A really strong correlation would be like 0.7 or higher. So this is an extremely strong correlation, which basically means that Lumia is measuring carotid flow time just as well as the gold standard Doppler measurement is. Okay. So in this last segment, I'm going to move on to what I call beta data. So right now, Lumia has 500 beta testers that are basically testing out these wearable versions of the devices and giving feedback so that the devices are optimized to when they go out to the general public. The data that I'm going to show is shared anonymously, and the participants gave permission for me to show this data. People often ask me what it's like to have dysautonomia, and I tell them it's like riding a roller coaster. Like my 7-year-old who was just in here is a coaster enthusiast, and I've had to experience a lot of moments like this. So that's what we have kind of seen with this Lumia device. So the first thing I wanted to show you was the daily data that we're able to get with the Lumia device looks really different in people with OI and healthy people. So like I showed you with ultrasound, there's this greater fluctuation in flow that happens in people with OI, POTS, dysautonomia. And we're seeing that with the Lumia device as well. So as people go throughout their day, they're having these big changes in in flow time that are just occurring in their daily life. But in healthy participants, their flow remains pretty stable throughout the day. We're also seeing some real life scenarios where people stand up. So this was an example, someone stood up right here, and we saw the white line is flow that drops pretty drastically and immediately. And then you see the tachycardia follows the heart rate signals in blue. So again, we're showing the time course of the changes in flow related to heart rate that Julian Stewart showed in his data. And there's again evidence that the flow drop is actually driving what we're seeing with the change in heart rate. So then this was another example of someone was feeling some symptoms. They put their feet up and we saw an increase in flow here. The blue lines actually down here are activity. That is a new feature on the Lumia device. And the heart rate data is not shown on this graph. But just people are trying out in their daily life what helps their symptoms and the time course of how quickly they're able to change their blood flow, either in a negative way or a positive way. Another thing we're showing with activities, this first example is someone was showering and they're like, why do I always feel worse in the shower? And they saw this change in blood velocity. I mean, this is pretty cool because you'd never be able to do an ultrasound in the shower. Those devices, like, that's just not feasible. They're not waterproof. But the Lumia device is. So we're able to see these changes that happen when people wear it in the shower. There's this drop in blood flow. And you can see too, there's some tachycardia happening, but it's a slightly later time course. And so this graph on the right is just showing changes in blood in flow time that happen during different activities. So this is after someone eats breakfast. There's a lot of cases of postprandial drops in flow. I'm sure you may have had some fatigue after eating a big meal. But we're actually seeing some changes in blood velocity as well. Then they had an instance where they were doing laundry and washing dishes, which probably involved some standing, and there was some drop in flow time there as well. Why isn't this clicking? There we go. Oh, I already showed this graph. This was the feet up again. Okay. And as a perk, I'm showing you some of my personal data. I've been wearing Lumia since October. So even though I've been consulting for them since January, I just got a device myself recently. And I wanted to show you some examples from my daily life. So I had this example where I was standing and talking to a colleague. This was a couple weeks ago. And, sorry. And I actually had some blurry vision and felt very symptomatic. And it was around 2:15 that I noted that. So I actually saw this drop in flow time when the white line, and then I also got some tachycardia that followed that. There was this time that I actually looked, like, retrospectively. I was like, oh, there was this drop in flow and some tachycardia here. And I looked at the time course. I had to be somewhere at 6 and I was working to, like, get my kids wrangled up and in the car. Other parents with young children probably understand that, and that significantly dropped my flow. So then I've also seen this really repeatable caffeine bump that happens in my day. So caffeine is a very controversial topic in POTS, and a lot of clinicians just say to avoid caffeine entirely, but I think it's a highly individualized decision. And I've actually seen a really repeatable I've seen a really repeatable increase in a little bit of tachycardia, but also a drastic increase in my flow time shortly after drinking coffee. So this day I drank coffee around 9 a.m. I'm a Dunkin' fan, not a Starbucks fan, for anyone wondering. And I see this nice boost in my blood flow following caffeine intake, which I think is pretty cool. I mean, I was going to drink coffee anyway, but now I feel like I have a prescription too because it increases my flow. So some ways that people ask, why is this data important? Why would I want Lumia? Where is Lumia heading in the future? Some things that I think are important are to be able to track what matters. A lot of people are trying to track both their symptoms and also some physiological markers. Something that's readily available that people track is with a wrist monitor like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit. People are tracking their heart rate, their parasympathetic or sympathetic indices with heart rate variability, which aren't totally validated. I could talk about that another time. But basically, we want to find a marker that correlates well to symptoms, that is physiologically relevant for POTS and OI, and Lumia gives us the ability to track what matters. The other benefit to Lumia is to see how different activities and treatments affect your lifestyle. Like I showed those graphs from the beta data and my own data, it's really interesting to see how different activities, like a bolus of fluid, compression, different lifestyle changes could affect your blood flow. And what is the time course of those? How should you time certain things in your day to protect your flow and optimize it? In the future, Lumia is working on FDA approval to become a diagnostic device to aid in diagnosis of POTS, because there's a big diagnostic delay, being able to see an expert clinician and be able to get a tilt table test. So the goal is to decrease diagnostic delay and also allow for chronic monitoring, since not even a 1 day, like a 10-minute snapshot is not always the best way to get an idea of what is going on chronically. Similar to how 24-hour blood, now there's a baby crying. Similar to how 24-hour blood pressure is used to look for hypertension now, instead of just one office visit. So at this point, I'm going to acknowledge the Lumia beta members who provided their data and all the people trying to optimize this device. Dysautonomia International, the Lumia team, who is building this device and developing all the facets of it. We also have a patient advisory council to aid Lumia, as well as scientific advisors. And I'm open to taking any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. There's so many really wonderful questions in the chat. I'm actually going to, sorry to put you guys on the spot, but I'm going to add Daniel and Shivani to help us maybe answer some of the questions in the chat, because there are about 40 really wonderful questions we won't all get to. So let's see, I am adding Shivani, and then I'll start reading some of these questions for us. Okay, so one of the first ones here, what do we do with the information from the device? If it shows low flow, then what do we do?
So right now, we don't advise, since it's not FDA approved, that you change any treatments based on the Lumia device. It's really just for your education to see what's happening in your daily life and what improves your flow, what makes it drop. But we're not, maybe in the future, it could help direct clinical decisions, but we're not recommending like you change medications because of it. And Shivani's probably going to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for everyday living, we can start to understand what are the things, what are the situations and the complex factors that are reducing the blood flow to the head, and what are the things that we can start doing more of to recover and restore that flow, and just to maintain the optimal state, that the best we can to get more things done every day. So for me personally, that usually comes down to setting a time limit so that I'm not in a prolonged state of low flow, and making sure I really prioritize some, legs up the wall or other recovery if I am going to have to be standing in a line or doing something on my feet for too long. But it's really helped me, if anything, just set better boundaries around the way I actually enforce those lifestyle habits and treatments, and really standing up for myself in a more metaphorical way with the demands that the world tries to place on us. So that really comes down to me saying, you know what, I'm not gonna shop in that way, or I'm not gonna cook in that way, or I'm not gonna host in that way, no matter what society tells me I should be doing, because I know there are consequences for myself that are associated with my symptoms, and that the more I can really be strong in my boundaries and optimize my treatments, the more and more I feel better and can have more energy to do more things. So I believe there's hope for all of us as we really just continue to adhere to the doctor's plan, and also go back to our doctors and say, hey, the things that you have me doing, I don't think it's enough. I need better options. Could we look at some research together and find out what might be a good treatment for me to explore?
Great. Thank you. I think there's, in a similar vein, Amanda asked, do we have an understanding of a baseline of normal brain blood flow in the way that we have normal heart rate range that we can compare to?
So with the Lumia device, I don't think we have like set standard norms, and it kind of varies for every person. So it's not like an absolute value for what is good blood flow versus low blood flow or high blood flow. It's really the change that everyone is experiencing. So it's important to track your own data and compare it to yourself What does your blood flow look like on a day you feel good? What does it look like on a worse day? How much does it drop when you stand up for or shower or do something that makes you feel symptomatic? Um, I've seen big ranges in blood flow, and the set app, the Lumia app gives you an average, so it's varies a lot person to person. Even with ultrasound, we don't have set normal values. We just know the percent changes that happen in different activities. Daniel, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think you covered it really well. I just
Okay.
wanted to maybe just add that like we are right now, it's kind of for self-management purposes. And so like it's not really around figuring out like, am I abnormal or normal? But we want to figure out what's abnormal for you. We are working on a diagnostic kind of pathway to try to have there be a way that you can interpret it that can be like a clinician can look at it and say, oh, you are actually, this is a clinically significant abnormal. It can't be used in it right now, but we have research, as Amanda shared earlier, that it looks like it can, but that's an FDA process before a doctor can trust it. So, and a lot of that has to not be with your baseline flow, it has to be with changes due to posture and changes due to a lot of stuff, as Amanda was sharing. But really, the one that's repeatable and a kind of test that a doctor can run is like lay down, stand up. Okay, that's not normal for you to drop that low. So that's kind of what we're kind of going towards, but it can't be used in that way technically for now.
Perfect. A question that has been asked in several different ways is about the affordability, and I think maybe if you can elaborate on the FDA approval in terms of like insurance and the future and the hopes and dreams of Lumia.
So I know the price point. Oh boy, do I remember it? Shivani, what's the price point?
So at the moment, devices are sold out, and we're
Uh-huh.
hoping to reopen orders pretty soon. The initiation kit, which is basically the hardware set that you would get, will be at $379. And then there is a ongoing membership on top of that is necessary to continue operating the device and get your data. And that is going to range depending on how much membership at a time you're buying. So between $14.99 and $19.99 a month. And I realize affordability is a question that varies for the individual circumstances, but Lumia has already gotten approval to be HSA and FSA eligible, subject to your individual plan's rules and requirements. So that is already available. And then in the future, there may be other options, as if there's some future state where a doctor might be able to order a device that would participate within your insurance program, but that would be in the future. I have to say that before I was part of the team here, I had ordered my own device just as an individual. And my perspective there was that of all the things that I've paid thousands of dollars for that ended up being pretty useless, even if I wasn't working here, I would still be thrilled to have access to what this is and for what it is for less than I think I paid for my Apple Watch. So, which is also a valuable tool. It's just, this is doing something that nothing else would have done for me.
Mhm.
Hey, before we move on, Amanda, do you mind turning off screen share so we can see everyone's lovely faces?
Oh, yeah, sure.
A lot of questions about, I think that you have beautifully answered this, but that we're no longer accepting beta testers, and then hopefully they'll be able to open up the device later on. Um, there was a really great question about the research for Dr. Miller here. Let me scroll back up. Oh, this one here. What has been the response to the device data so far by medical providers? Have patients been able to get better diagnosis or care? And I think, Shivani, you've talked about this in the group before. If you guys care to talk on that.
So as far as I'll answer the end of that first. Affecting care, it hasn't really gone to that point yet, since this isn't an FDA approved device. Like, doctors aren't really reviewing the data for their patients. Very few people even have this. I mean, 500 is a drop in the bucket. But the response to medical professionals and even expert autonomic doctors from the conferences we've been to has been really great. They see the potential. We have medical advisors. We have had meetings with different medical professionals, and they're all, well, I shouldn't say all, they're mostly very interested in this device and the potential it has to improve for patients to just use it to track their own lifestyle and care, but also the potential it has for diagnosis and treatment as well. It's just not really there yet that clinicians are able to review the data and recommend things based on it because it's not FDA approved. But the feedback from our research has been really positive. We were just at the American Autonomic Society meeting last month. Was that? Yeah, I was in November, early November. And that's where we presented both the studies I talked about, and there was really great feedback.
I might also add in that conversation, we had, I mean, lots of the very like senior leadership at AAS was very supportive and helping kind of, we were working on our diagnostic use case and they were very excited to help like contribute to that. So we are having a lot of kind of interest from the like really top specialists in the field.
Yeah, that's what I would add is that there's a lot of buzz and fascination with the device and hopefulness about what this will mean for the community in the future. So I think you're absolutely correct there. This is kind of just a fun one for Amanda or Shivani, since you guys, I'm sure you both have your device in right now. Someone just wants to see how you put it in.
Oh, okay, I'll start.
Mine
So I have
too.
it here. You could do this too. You have one also.
Yeah, we can all just
So
we can all
this
do
is,
it here.
ooh, let me
Simultaneous.
turn off my blur. Yeah,
So
go
I
ahead.
can walk you through it, like holding in my left hand, I would grasp the device by the tail, which is this wiggly tail at the bottom, and pointing the nose of the device into my Simba concha. So there's a little bit of a landmark to learn there. So it's not in the ear canal, but above, and I just kind of pop it in there. And a well-fitted Lumia, at least in our consumer device here, it should be comfortable. In fact, if it's well fitted, generally you probably don't feel it at all once you've adapted a little bit. And it should feel quite secure. So I can, do things with my ear and it's not just going to jump out. And the third dimension of a great fit would be that we're getting really nice contact of the lenses against my skin so that we can get a great signal quality and get high quality information going into the app.
Yeah,
Yes, I think
that's what it looks like.
interesting.
Shivani does these like web Facebook lives all the time, so she's used to showing this, but it's super tiny. I don't know how to like demonstrate that. But yeah, it's taken me a little practice. I've only been wearing it for like a month, really. I got it sometime in October, but I can put it in pretty easily now. And
Well,
it's pretty comfortable. I've had mine fallen out. It's fallen out twice, but I found it both times. So that's been kind of, I don't know if we want to get into that can of worms, but we're looking into stability.
Yes. Yeah, I can agree that I don't feel mine, and I've never had an issue with mine falling out either. This is probably a good one for Shivani, since you have been wearing yours for the longest and can speak anecdotally. Can you say more about how blood flow variation differs between, for instance, standing up and bending over, or doing activities in the kitchen, versus driving, or what variation you're seeing in your personal usage?
Yeah, so just to give an overview of my situation and my treatment path, I am diagnosed with POTS and I have the BP spiking style of POTS. So orthostatic hypertension with mine, also HEDS and mast cell activation syndrome. And so for me, my treatment is really focused on returning the blood supply to my heart and my head. So I had always considered myself pretty well optimized and managed, but I knew that I was still obviously affected and wanted to optimize more. So for me, I use a lot of compression garments. I use a medication called droxidopa or Northera, and then caffeine has been a major winner for me. But even with all of my treatments on board, I'm very, very strongly affected by body position and just the forces of gravity. So if I take off my compression within standing still for about 30 seconds, we can see a pretty profound crash in my flow. And even with my compression on, I have to be pretty mindful of how much time I'm going to be upright. So when I am upright, if I'm sitting upright, like for hours and hours of Zoom meetings, it's really important for me personally to sit cross-legged. And if I'm sitting cross-legged upright for 3 hours of meetings, we can see kind of a slow draining out of my flow index. But if I sit with my feet on the floor, I'm not even going to make it for a half an hour. There's just no way. And that's with all the best meds on board. So for me, it's very positional functional. And then I get an instant recovery with my legs up. And, usually at 15 or 20 minutes, I'm actually still increasing my flow. So I'm learning that, yeah, legs up the wall, like hop on a couch or a bed, stick my feet up the wall is extremely effective. But it does, I do benefit even past the 10 minutes. I benefit, I think, up to an hour of inversion. And that effect is extremely transient. So again, if I don't have my compression on and I just stand still in the kitchen for 3 minutes making a drink or washing a dish, it all crashes again. So I'm very gravity dependent, and I think we'll be seeing more and more of that from the many people who are, again, beginning to wear in our beta community. And I'll just close that by saying, I see there's a lot of questions about, what about this situation? What about that situation? What about stenting? What about driving? What about this procedure or that procedure? Right now, we've asked our beta members to kind of keep things under wraps while we continue developing the app and build out the graphs, build out the tagging and the features for them. But pretty soon we're going to sort of release the hounds on all this, release the community to start sharing. I think that's going to be pretty soon. It'll be Daniel's call. But at that point, probably the first place people will be sharing their graphs, their stories, their diagnoses, their treatments, what's happening in their graphs. It's going to be a really special time and it's already very special within the beta group, but once that's in other places and a little bit more public places or our open interest Facebook group, it's going to be really special to see how unique and how diverse each person, and yet what are our commonalities. But we do have individuals that respond and their graphs and data are quite different than mine, or they're on very different treatments like ivabradine, Corlinor, or beta blockers, where they're getting the flow drops without any response or much response in heart rate. So I think it's always important when I share any of my data or my story that we keep in mind that, your data might look different, and that's okay. A lot depends on someone's anatomy and someone's treatment plan.
Perfect. I think that answers it perfectly. This is something that Dr. Miller touched on earlier. But if a patient buys it for self-use, can they keep data private, and what privacy protections are there?
That's probably more of a Shivani question.
Yeah.
Right now, we're not sharing data unless there's permission, and it's all anonymized. I think there will be an opt-in for participating in research studies, but again, like, we're not going to single out people's name and their specific data. But maybe you can
Correct. So, privacy is really important. The data security is really important to us. And even though we're not, right now, we're not a medical device and we're not subject to HIPAA, everything that we're building is with that future path in mind. So there are things we're building in the app that are in some ways peculiar or different than other wellness apps. For example, people are saying, why can't I write, notes and custom tags on things? It's like, well, if we want to keep this HIPAA compliant for the future, it's really important that we don't allow anyone to, put information that could be later identifying for them. So if they put in their names of their kids or the names of their spouse or where they work, that information could be identifying. So we're trying to build the app in a way that even if you weren't being thoughtful, that your privacy would be protected and that your data stays de-identified. And as Dr. Miller just mentioned, there will be an option pretty soon, we'll see, where individuals could opt in to allowing their de-identified private data to be used in research. And so that program, we're not quite ready to launch that, but once that is available, all the details would be available. So the individual could, clearly choose whether they want to contribute that anonymous de-identified data for research. And honestly, that's one of course, I'm excited about like myself being better self-managed for my symptoms, but even more exciting is what's going to happen to research in this space for all of us with these conditions. So that's what I'm super excited about. But short answer is privacy is something we take very seriously.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I know we're at the end of the webinar. Daniel, I can see him typing away quickly, trying to get some of your questions answered in the Q&A section. Real quickly,
working
since
on
I
it
am the
too.
development director, I would be remiss if I didn't mention We are currently in our grant cycle for POTS research as well as dysautonomia research. We received $9 million worth of applications from researchers across the world. We will be funding $1.2 million of research this year, thanks to the generosity of our donors and our corporate sponsors. And so if you would like to contribute to either the POTS Research Fund, the Dysautonomia Research Fund, or Dysautonomia International at large, you can do so at curedys.org. And the more funding that we receive, if you designate it to POTS, we will be giving away more money towards the POTS. I will say that Lumia is one of our applicants this year. And they, of course, always have really wonderful research for us. Just because I'm seeing it asked about 10 times, can you guys quickly speak on, again, when the device might be available to Canada or international users?
International, I would say there's no timeline right now. In fact, we're challenged to even tell you when you can order here in the USA. But I will say that research opportunities are already unfolding. We do have research that has just been initiated in Calgary with Dr. Satish Raj. And so I think those types of activities, it's exciting for me to see that because, again, it's about laying the foundations for expansion and doing more and making Lumia more available to everyone who needs it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Daniel, I know you were reading questions. Are there any that you see that you'd like to speak on?
There's been a bunch that I've been trying to answer. Nothing. I think Shivani and Amanda answered most of the
Yeah,
good
a
ones.
lot of people were asking about size and sensitivity. So there are different, those, like we showed, those like little silicone jackets are sized for your ear. So they fit a wide variety of ear. It comes in a little pill case like Shivani's holding up. So it's very like similar to what we're used to using if you take meds and a pill organizer. And also people were asking about MCAS and skin sensitivity. So we can't speak for everyone, but in the beta group, we've had a lot of people with MCAS and people haven't had sensitivities to the silicone really. So that shouldn't be so much of an issue. Of course, it could be potentially an issue for anyone, but we haven't seen a lot of that.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I think we may have set a new record for the number of attendees at our webinar, at least in recent history, per our director of events. We're very excited to have you guys. And thank you, Dr. Miller, for presenting your information, and to the Lumia team for joining us and answering questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.